It's starting to look like the beginning of the end for the New Orleans Saints and all-pro right tackle Ryan Ramczyk. We got all of that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? I'm your host, Ross Jackson, New Orleans native, your New Orleans Saints expert and credentialed member of the media covering those New Orleans Saints as a senior writer and reporter over at Saint News Network. On today's episode of Locked On Saints, we're honing in again on the offensive line, which continues to be a huge story for the New Orleans Saints this offseason. Everybody should be rooting for 7th-round rookie Josiah Ezirim. I'll tell you why. I'm also going to explain to you why Andrus Peat moving on from the New Orleans Saints, or the Saints moving on from Andrus Peat, is just another step towards the new status quo for who this team has decided that they are, even though I think they should have kept him. And we're going to lead everything off with the newest details in the Ryan Ramczyk situation. The future just gets murkier and murkier, but clearer and clearer at the same time, especially with this new contract detail that is hit around Ramczyk's deal. We got all that coming up for you on today's episode, and we appreciate you very much for making us your first listen of the day every day here on Locked On Saints, and for being an everydayer here at the show, which is a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends at Monopoly Go. I have a competitive side and it absolutely loves Monopoly Go. It's the mobile hit twist on the classic Monopoly game that you already know and love. So join your friends and download Monopoly Go today for free on the App Store or Google Play. So the New Orleans Saints have again made some adjustments to Ryan Ramczyk's contract, and I want to break them all down. But the bottom line here is that it looks like the beginning of the end for the New Orleans Saints and Ryan Ramczyk, and that Ryan Ramczyk might be trending towards that retirement that we've been thinking about. You look at the way that the Saints have redone this contract, and it feels awfully familiar. We've seen it with Drew Brees, reducing the total base salary down to veteran minimum right ahead of June. Patrick Robinson, same thing. Malcolm Jenkins, same thing, although they did it with Malcolm Jenkins way, way early. And so a few of us were like, yeah, that's definitely coming. We saw it earlier this offseason with James Hurst as well, very similar to Ryan Ramczyk. Took his bonuses, got rid of them, ended up taking that base salary all the way down to veteran minimum. And then weeks later, there you go. He ended up retiring before the NFL draft. And that was one of the reasons why I was convinced that the Saints already knew that that was on the way because of the way that they redid this contract. Well, the way that they've redone Ryan Ramczyk's contract now feels very similar. Now, don't forget that he also restructured his contract much earlier this offseason as well. In the process of doing that, his base salary already came down to pretty close to veteran minimum. It is now at veteran minimum, but is now also set to expire or void, if you will, if he ends up retiring. So the Saints would get that $1.21 million back conceivably. So let's discuss what the new details of the contract are, why they signal the end of Ryan Ramczyk's career being kind of more than potential at this point, and what happens to the New Orleans Saints if he decides to retire salary cap wise. So let's break all of that down. First thing I want to do is go over the incentives themselves. So as we look at the incentives, it's basically a bunch of money that is moved into 2025 that are going to be based on 2024's playing time. So he's going to have a roster bonus set for 2025. That's all going to be based on what he does or doesn't do this year. This leaves the door open for the potential of play for Ryan Ramczyk. $500,000, $500,000 goes his way if he plays 68% of offensive snaps. Another $1 million goes his way if he plays 75%, and then an additional $1.5 million for each benchmark of 85, 90, and 95% of offensive snaps as well. So he could make $3 million, $6 million. My apologies. My math was way off. $9 million in total with all these things, but he'll make $6 million just in terms of playtime incentives for his 2025 roster bonus if he hits all those incentives in 2024. I highly doubt he hits all of these incentives in 2024. He can get an additional $3 million for not only playing 90% of offensive snaps for the team, but the team also getting a playoff win. He would also get another $1 million if he is a Pro Bowl starter. And as long as he actually plays outside of being medically cleared, medically excused, or being in the Super Bowl, of course. And then he gets an additional $1 million for being all pro plus the team's playoff opportunity there as well. All these numbers, thanks to our good friend Catherine Terrell over at ESPN at @Cat_Terrell on your favorite social media. So $9 million in total is the possible boost for Ryan Ramczyk in 2025 that he can earn here in 2024. The thing about these incentives is that they're not built to be earned, right? 68% of snaps is a relatively high margin for a $500,000 bonus for a guy that has been your starter since 2017. You feel what I'm saying? These numbers aren't built for anyone to hit. Now, they leave the door open, and I've continuously said this. If Ryan Ramczyk surprises everybody and is able to go at the beginning of the season, then great. He has an opportunity here in 2024 to earn a bunch of money in 2025. But he's playing on a bunch of nothing throughout the case of 2024, if that's the case, right? Because all that money is getting pushed into 2025 as he earns it. He's earning vet minimum and then the restructured signing bonus that he had earlier on this offseason. That's kind of it. So is he going to want to go out there and play on that with this medical situation and having to try to earn money for himself in 2025? The logic just isn't necessarily there. So that's what the incentives are. So the reason that I believe that this kind of signals the end of Ryan Ramczyk's career is what I just mentioned. Doesn't make sense to play all through 2024, not having earned money for yourself in 2024, having taken a massive pay cut effectively for 2024, and then trying to stack some numbers for 2025 that you may or may not hit. This just kind of gives you an opportunity, maybe if you are the Saints, to say, okay, we're going to start you off on the physically unable to perform list. You get 6 weeks to get out onto the field. If you can't get out onto the field, we'll shut you down for the season. You can retire before next year. You can retire mid-season, whatever it might be. Or they just expedite this process and say, you know what? This is kind of where we are. All this money got moved around to make it easier for you to make that decision. Let us know when you're ready to make the decision. And maybe that's the way that this goes. Now, what I will say is that it should not be a surprise to either A, not hear about a retirement until after June 1st, or B, hear about a retirement before June 1st, but not see it processed until after June 1st. You can only do 2 post-June 1 designated cuts. But if you're simply waiting to file paperwork until after June 1st, or if something just simply doesn't happen until after June 1st, then you're typically fine in the eyes of the NFL. So what the Saints could do is that instead of, if Ryan Ramczyk were to up and retire today and they process that paperwork today, over $35 million of dead cap from previous restructures hits their toll. If they wait until after June 1st, June 2nd or beyond, $12 million, a little bit over $12 million. So basically what it would do is defer that additional, $23 million or so to next year. And so you can plan for that, deal with that, all those other things. And they would get the additional quote unquote salary cap aid of what isn't being picked up from his contract for next year. And of course, the $1.21 million that you'll save this year. So not a ton of savings, but definitely keeps you from taking on any additional loss here. You would come out at 0 on the loss. You're not saving any money. You're not gaining a bunch of money, or you might gain $1.21 million. But the biggest thing is that you're chopping $35 million in dead cap all the way down to 12. And I think that that's what you would be looking for the New Orleans Saints to do here. So if he ends up retiring, the Saints have a way for this to all work out, be very light on their books, not really impact them in 2024. Then they have the plan for 2025. And it will also effectively open up the right tackle spot for Taliesin Fuanga to come in and immediately start on the New Orleans Saints offensive line as their first round pick. So the Saints are prepared for this. At this point, I think it's just a matter of when, not if. Now, what we thought might be a matter of if, not when, was the reunion of the New Orleans Saints and offensive lineman Andrus Peat. Andrus Peat, though, now heading to the Las Vegas Raiders, which is an ongoing sort of theme of the New Orleans Saints offseason of shedding the previous regime. We got that coming up for you as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends at Monopoly Go. You've heard all about my competitive side. You've heard all about the leaderboards, all those other things. But let me tell you about some of the other new and exciting, ever-changing features when it comes to Monopoly Go. The more that you end up winning, playing with other friends, all those other things, the more awesome prizes and additional content you unlock. And there's a ton more to get. You can get cool new playing pieces to help you travel the boards with. You can get hilarious emojis so that you can taunt friends when you smash down their buildings or heist their vaults. Yeah, this is a different level of Monopoly. We're talking about wrecking balls and heisting vaults. It's very, very fun. Always something new and exciting, and a constantly changing tournaments and challenges as well, like mini games like digging up treasure and stuff like that. Like, there's just a ton for you to check out. So you can get massive multipliers on everything that you win, and rent frenzies as well. Look, there's just simply always something fun to discover with Monopoly Go. So get off the bench and get into the game and go and download Monopoly Go today on Google Play or the App Store. All right, family, the departure of offensive lineman Andrus Peat is just another example of what feels like the New Orleans Saints' greatest MO this offseason, shedding the previous regime. We got that coming up for you here as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. We appreciate you as always for making us your first listen of the day, every day here on the show. Don't forget to go and check out the Locked On Sports Today 24/7 national sports stream, the first of its kind on YouTube. All the biggest stories from around the world of sports, not all the yelling, screaming, arguing, all that kind of stuff, from the experts that know the teams that are getting those big stories the best, over with our Locked On local experts. So go check it out today, Locked On Sports Today on YouTube, or for free on the Amazon Fire TV Channels app. YouTube is free too. I want you to know that the Channels app is also free. So make sure you go and check it out, Locked On Sports Today. All right. So I have been sort of consistently like making mention of Andrus Peat as a potential option for the New Orleans Saints to potentially bring back, because he gives you the guard tackle versatility. He's the guy that kind of saved your butt last year when it came to your left tackle spot, when you gave up on Trevor Penning, maybe a little bit too early, all those other things. But I think you probably felt me consistently be lukewarm on the idea. And the reason why I was kind of lukewarm on the idea is because it doesn't match what the New Orleans Saints have done so far this season, which is shed the Sean Payton days. Look at the complete revamp of the offensive coaching staff, right? Look at the departures of players like Zach Bond, the trading away of Adam Troutman during the draft last year to Sean Payton himself, them, moving on from CJ Gardner-Johnson, them, moving on from, Michael Thomas earlier this offseason, all those things. These feel like concerted efforts to kind of turn the page for the franchise. And look, this isn't unique to the New Orleans Saints, right? We see this all the time. We watched Cliff Kingsbury take over as the head coach in Arizona 1 year after they invested a first-round pick in Josh Rosen, and then draft his guy in Kyler Murray, and then shed the previous regime's quarterback and the previous regime's offensive pieces and things like that. We see this all the time. This happens when you change offensive coordinators. Typically, the rest of the coaching staff changes, or the majority of the additional offensive coaching staff ends up changing. You change your head coach, the coordinators and additional staff on both sides typically change. The Saints kind of did this in a multi-year format. Dennis Allen came in, took over as the head coach in 2020, ahead of 2022. He gets his first draft in at that point, but you also saw them flip a bunch of the, some of the defensive coaching staff during that time. Flipped the wide receiver coach, went for the younger guy, all that in Cody Burns. Then after his first year, they completely redid the defensive coaching staff, getting rid of Ryan Nielsen and Chris Richard, bringing in Marcus Robertson and Joe Woods and all that. Like, they kind of revamped that defensive coaching staff a bit. They changed over defensive line coaches, all these other things. Then you get into 2024 here, this offseason, where they completely revamped the entire offensive coaching staff, with the exception of Clancy Barone, who was brought in 1 year prior. So he was a part of the sort of multi-year process. And so now that we've watched the New Orleans Saints finally shed themselves of effectively Sean Payton's coaching staff, sans Michael Hodges and Dennis Allen himself, I guess, the next logical place are the players, the roster. And we've seen the Saints doing this. I mean, we just mentioned guys like Zach Bond and Michael Thomas being on their way out the door this offseason, them trading away CJ Gardner-Johnson years ago, them moving on from Caden Ellis last offseason, not because they didn't want him, but because they couldn't afford him. He had an opportunity for a full-time role somewhere else. The Saints didn't have to offer him all these other things. We've watched them move on from, Ian Book pretty quickly after Sean Payton left. We saw, even the quarterback situation now, right? Like they drafted Jake Haener, but then you got a new offensive coordinator in, and the new offensive coordinator kind of went, hey, I like the Spencer Rattler guy. And then you got him with Spencer Rattler. Like that's another example of how these things work. If we look at going back to, let's call it 2021, right? 2022 was Dennis Allen's first draft. All 5 of the players that they drafted in that, with actually 4 of the 5 players. So if you leave Jordan Jackson out, who ended up going to Denver to reunite with Sean Payton over there, or not reunite, but unite with Sean Payton over there. Chris Olave, Trevor Penning, Alontae Taylor, DeMarco Jackson, all on the roster, right? But then you go to 2021 and beyond. Let's go back to 2015 because Andrus Peat was the last remaining 2015-er that was on this roster. The Saints have 9 players from those draft classes, including a draft class back in 2015 that itself was 9 players, right? So it's not super unusual to see players that your team drafted in 2014, 2015 not be on your roster. But look, 2015, no one's left. 2016, now that Michael Thomas has departed, no one's left. 2017, Marshawn Lattimore, Ryan Ramczyk, Alvin Kamara all remain, but we just talked about the potential retirement of Ryan Ramczyk, so we might be taking him off the list. All offseason, we've been talking about the potential or lack thereof or re-presence of or whatever, reignition of Marshawn Lattimore trade conversations. What if he gets traded? Then all of a sudden, the only one you've got left is Alvin Kamara. Heavily lauded as one of the best draft classes in NFL history, certainly one of the best in New Orleans Saints history. You might have one of those guys left. Now, we are talking 7 years later. So, yeah, average NFL career is 3.5 years. That makes sense. You got 2 phases, maybe a little bit more out of that. Then we go to the 2018 draft class. None of them are left. The only ones left in the NFL right now are Marcus Davenport, Traquan Smith, Boston Scott, and Will Clapp. But none of them are on the New Orleans Saints roster. 2019, only Eric McCoy was retained. They traded away CJ Gardner-Johnson. Caden Ellis signed with the Atlanta Falcons last offseason. 2020, Cesar Ruiz, the only one left. They traded away Adam Troutman during the draft last year and said, you can go back to Sean. Sent him literally back to Sean Payton. And then Zach Bond left this offseason. 2021, you got a couple of these guys still. Peyton Turner, Pete Werner, Paulson Adebo. But I'm going to tell you why that's important. Because one of those guys, they just didn't pick up the 5th-year option on, Peyton Turner. And then Pete Werner and Paulson Adebo are still in contract, going into contract seasons, with both of them having something to prove, right? So I look at all this and I say, okay, there's 9 players from 2015 to 2021. There's only 9 players left that were invested in when it comes to the draft. Majority of the free agents collected during this time also gone, right? You look back to even 2022 when they brought in guys like, Jarvis Landry and all that, gone, right? So the thing that I highlight here too is that of those 9 players, 8 of them are either defensive players or offensive linemen. Peyton Turner, Pete Werner, Paulson Adebo from 2021, they're all still on the roster as of right now. All defensive players. Eric McCoy, Cesar Ruiz, offensive lineman. Ryan Ramczyk, offensive lineman. Marshawn Lattimore, defensive player. The only exception is Alvin Kamara from 2017. So, look, keeping Andrus Peat, I think, would have been a wise move, but it just didn't feel like it was going to align with what the New Orleans Saints have been doing all offseason. And really in phases over the course of the past couple of years, which is move on, turn the page. And so the Saints not rehashing things with Andrus Peat might be a decision that hurts them when it comes to their offensive line depth, maybe even offensive line starters. But you know what? At the same time, it pushes this franchise a little bit a step forward. Even though they might not be very good, we'll see what happens, but at least pushes things a step forward in terms of turning the page on what used to be and now looking ahead to what is going to be. And I think that that is an important thing. And that's one of the reasons why I was always kind of lukewarm on the Andrus Peat idea, because going back to Pete, just didn't match what we've seen from this New Orleans Saints franchise all offseason long. Coming up next, let's take a look at Josiah Ezirim. No one is more excited about anything than Josiah Ezirim is to be a New Orleans Saint. And for that reason alone, we should all be rooting for the 7th round pick. We got that coming up for you as we continue on and wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by friends at FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the Locked On Podcast Network. And there's so much to check out over on FanDuel, including NFL draft props, rookie props like offensive rookie of the year, defensive rookie of the year, all that. But don't forget, it is also win or go home time in the NBA and NHL as well. And FanDuel is giving you everything that you need to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers are going to get $150 in bonus bets by winning any $5 bet. So you just pick a heavy favorite, like right now, the Boston Celtics tonight, 12-point favorites over the Cleveland Cavaliers. Throw $5 down on that. Win a little bit if the Boston Celtics win, if you feel really good about it. But no matter what, if you win that $5 bet, you're getting $150 coming back to you as well. 30-1 odds right away. And you can use on spreads, on money lines, on player props, and much more. So go and check them out today. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. We should all be rooting for a 7th round draft pick, Josiah Ezirim, the offensive tackle out of Eastern Kentucky University, drafted by the New Orleans Saints at pick 239 in the 7th round. And I don't think that there was a 1st round prospect through 6th round prospect that was more excited to be selected by his team than Josiah Ezirim was to be selected by the New Orleans Saints. And look, who can blame him? Okay. This is a guy that played defensive tackle before he ended up moving over to offensive tackle just 2 years ago. And he did it because he was effectively told by his coaches, hey, if you want to get out on the field, if you want to see playing time, this might be the best option for you, is to move from defensive line to offensive line. And so what did he do? He said, you know what? I want to be on the field. So yeah, I'll learn a new position. Played that position for 2 years and then became one of 250-ish players to be selected in the NFL draft in 2024. How cool is that? And he was selected at his position, offensive tackle. That's where the New Orleans Saints see him. We asked Dennis Allen, where is it that you see him? You see him being an outside guy, an inside guy. They said they're going to start him out at tackle. And when you're 6'5", 320 pounds-ish, and you got 35-inch arms, yeah, that makes a lot of sense that that's where you're going to start because he's got the tools to be able to pan out there, 328 pounds. So he comes in as a guy that has good mobility, that's got good athleticism from playing on the defensive line. I think Dennis Allen even mentioned, I look at defensive linemen as typically being more athletic than offensive linemen. Now, maybe that's just the defensive coach speak happening there. But you get that type of athleticism that you like from a defensive lineman, and then you add them to your offensive line, and all of a sudden, that ends up potentially panning out for you. Now, he's a developmental prospect. This isn't a guy that we're looking at to have any kind of immediate impact maybe here in 2024. He might be able to come in and help on special teams. He might end up being a candidate for you too, especially you lost James Hurst. You didn't bring back Andrus Peat. Or you're looking for a swing offensive lineman that's not Landon Young, because you can maybe move Landon Young inside if you need to, see if Nick Saldiveri is ready for left guard. Like, they might be a little occupied. And so you have a guy like Josiah Ezirim who might be able to step in and say, I got this, and then be your swing tackle and all that. Then you get really, really nice athleticism out there to help you out in those areas. And so I think for all the things that we can look at and say, why should we believe that Josiah Ezirim, a 7th round draft pick out of Eastern Kentucky, will pan out? It's not that you need to believe that he'll pan out. It's just, what does he have that shows you that, yeah, he could. He's got the tools. And I think you're looking at size, which is irrefutable, 6'5", 328 pounds. You look at length and reach, 35-inch arms. Yeah, the dude can play tackle, right? Athleticism, he's got it. He can move really well laterally, gets up to the second level very quickly. That's the athleticism that he gets from playing over on the defensive line. And he has an understanding of what it is that will tell a defensive line what's planning to happen pre-snap, so he can kind of keep that under wraps. He also knows how to influence defensive linemen because, if I'm looking at it from my perspective, I'm a former defensive lineman playing on the offensive line, just in this hypothetical, right? There's nothing about me otherwise that would say that I've ever played in the trenches with football. I would get demolished there very quickly. But if I look at my position and I say, okay, well, when I play defensive line, when an offensive lineman would do this, then I would know to do this. Then there's an opportunity for you to maybe even set some guys up, things like that. Like one of the things that I'm very, very curious and very excited to see, a little bit of a tangent coming here, is how Colin Saunders' pass rush plan on the interior builds up. Last year, he was very focused on understanding his rules, understanding his assignments, his fits, things like that. This year, he's got that all down. So now he gets to add the ornamentation to it and progress. So when you talk about adding ornamentation, you talk about kind of like doing all these things. Like Josiah Ezirim has done some level of that from his development as a defensive lineman that he can now use as knowledge over in the offensive line. Oh, sometimes you flash a hand over here to get this thing done. Sometimes you do a false step over here to get this thing done, whatever it might be. He can be ready for it. Kind of read those things. And so that's going to be a part of his development as well. Now, when I talk about this, I'm not talking about it from like him lining up across from, one of the Bosa brothers or TJ Watt. I'm talking about him at practice working against another, developing defensive lineman, right? That's what we're looking at here for 2024. Not him going out there and going up against some of the elite offense or defensive, ends or rushers in the NFL. I'm talking about what he can do in practice, what he can show as a practice squad member, as a depth player, whatever it might be. These are the things that I think will end up benefiting him. The things that will get in his way are, of course, the leaping competition coming from Eastern Kentucky University to the NFL. Not going to be the easiest transition in the world. You also look at just basically general knowledge of the position. And he's got a lot to learn. Now he's going to have a really, really good developer in John Benton working with him. And it's clear that John Benton and the New Orleans Saints like this guy. Otherwise, they would have never drafted him, right? So they definitely look at him as a developmental, as a project, right? And that's okay. That's fine. That's what you do in day 3. That's what you do in the 7th round. But boy, are we going to be rooting for this guy or what? I mean, just knowing how ridiculously excited he was to be drafted, just knowing and having heard about his leadership acumen when he was at Eastern Kentucky, the attitude that he has, the grace that he brings to the football field. When I talk about grace, I don't necessarily mean movement-wise. I mean like graciousness that he brings to the football field, how appreciative he is to be on a football field every time that he steps on one, how appreciative he is to be in a locker room every time that he is in one, all of those things that we've heard, seen videos of, all that. It's awesome. It's awesome. And I said this about Jalen Ford, and I'll say it here about Josiah Ezirim. Every player that's going to make this leap successfully from college to the pros, forget if you're coming from Texas in a blue blood program, or if you're coming from University of Northern Iowa or Eastern Kentucky, a smaller program, right? Forget any of that. If you're making the leap to the NFL from college, you have to check a certain number of boxes in order to be a guy that's going to make it. It doesn't mean that every single person that checks those boxes does make it, but every single person that does make it checks all those boxes, right? Kind of that whole thing about how like a square is a rectangle, or a rectangle is a square, but a square is not a rectangle, or whatever it is. You know what I'm saying? I haven't done geometry in years. And so the way that I look at it is Josiah Ezirim checks a lot of boxes, right? Height, weight, size, right? He has the athleticism. He's got the reach. He's got the length. He has the physical tools to play the position. He has the want to play the position. He has the wherewithal to play the position. He checks a lot of the boxes. Now let's see if he'll be one of those guys that checks the boxes and succeeds at the next level. It's not a guarantee, but man, I'm going to be rooting for this dude. I'm going to be rooting for this dude because it's just one of those stories that you'd love to see pan out. Like Zach Strief, right? Like watching him pan out from being a late round pick and all those other things. Like that was awesome. That was awesome. That's what the NFL is all about. It's not about the first round picks that make it. No duh when they do, right? It's surprising when they don't, even though most of them don't. But it's exciting when the 7th round guy does. It's exciting when the undrafted free agent like Carl Granderson pans out. That's where Josiah Ezirim is, and I'm excited to see it. I'm just excited to see it. All right. Coming up in tomorrow's episode, we're going to be taking a look at some of the undrafted free agents, and of course, we're going to start off with Dallin Holker, coming out of Colorado State University, the tight end that everybody believes will make the roster. We'll take a deeper look at his game, what he brings, what he has to show, all these other things. And of course, we'll break down more of the biggest stories around the New Orleans Saints as well. Appreciate you being here for another episode, y'all, and for making us your first listen of the day every day. Locked on Pelicans with Jake Madison, Locked on LSU with Caroline Fenton should be your second listen today, so that you can check out what's going on all around Locked On Louisiana. And real quick, before we wrap up, I want to give a big shout out to Julius, to Aurelian, to V, to everybody over at Pres Hall that made us feel so welcome and everything. We had such a wonderful time there last night. Of course, seeing my homeboy V out during Jazz Fest and everything. Jay Frost, the incredible artist, like just so much happened over the course of this last week. So I appreciate y'all very much for all the love, all the support. Please know the love and support comes right back to you from me. We appreciate you very much as always. Make it Locked On Saints a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me and the show. As always, if you see me, please say hi. And if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you living. Let me know how you momming them. And trust you, that nation. I'll holla at you.